So I'll continue with the theme of space plasmas, and I will describe you the results of our project. Let me start by acknowledging my collaborators. A partial list is here. So we are interested in plasma turbulence, and the first thing to say is that plasma turbulence is just like fluid turbulence, a universal process. Plays an important role really in the dynamics of many systems across a wide range of scales. It's a key player in laboratory experiments on magnetized fusion, operates in the solar corona and probably plays a very important role there, solar wind, heliosphere, and presumably astrophysical objects as well. So this plot shows the famous measurement of density fluctuations in the interstellar medium, and there is hard to see, but there's 12 orders of magnitude here over which the density fluctuations exhibit a Kolmogorov-like spectrum, most likely indicating that this is a turbulent medium. The focus of our particular project is on solar wind-like turbulence, and the motivation for this is twofold. First of all, we expect that there is a certain degree of universality about the turbulence. So if you learn something about plasma turbulence in one system, you can have a lot to say about turbulence in other systems as well. And solar wind is a really nice example of plasma turbulence. It's accessible. We have spacecraft that perform in situ measurements in the solar wind. An example is shown here. It's a spectrum of magnetic fluctuations in the solar wind, and you can see that it looks like a textbook picture of a turbulent spectrum. There are at least three characteristic ranges of scales visible in this figure. At very large scale, the system has certain memory about how the energy was injected into it, so it kind of remembers the way it was stirred. Then there's a transition to a sharper power law, which looks like a Kolmogorov spectrum in fluid turbulence. And this is thought to be the inertial range, the range of scales where the memory of the energy input is forgotten, and in nonlinear interactions kind of transfer the energy down the scales in a lossless manner, and the statistics here is probably universal. And then there's a steepening towards smaller scales when the cascade reaches the internal plasma scales. There's steepening, which in fluids you would think is a dissipation range, and in plasmas could be a little bit more complicated. In addition to being a good example of generic turbulence, the turbulence in the solar wind is of interest because it is also thought to play a role in the dynamics. A solar wind, there are a lot of interesting questions about solar wind, starting from how it is accelerated to why is it so hot when we see it near the Earth. And a lot of the answers, a lot of the possibilities discussed in the literature depend on the presence of turbulence and the dissipation of the turbulence. So understanding of turbulence in general is what you might call a grand challenge problem. It's decades or maybe centuries of work, and certainly more work is required before complete understanding is reached. We are focusing on a particular aspect of plasma turbulence, namely on the plasma physics aspect of this turbulence. And there are two sets of questions that I will discuss. So one set of questions refers to the physics of this short wavelengths range of scales. So what happens here is that really dissipation? Is it just the change in the properties of the fluctuations? How does the dissipation occur? In a fluid turbulence, the dissipation is typically associated with viscosity. In the types of plasmas that we're interested in, the viscosity is very small, and the dissipation is a collective effect. It's a result of collective interaction of particles with the electromagnetic field. And there are many specific mechanisms that have been discussed in the literature What is missing, however, is the understanding of how these mechanisms work in a particular setting, how they operate, how they interact. And another set of questions refers to the possibility of cross-scale coupling in the inertial range. Some of the possibilities involve formation of coherent structures such as current sheets, and the fact that evolution of those current sheets depends on the microscopic physics. I'll be talking a little bit more about this. So as far as the computational approach, it's a hard problem to tackle. So plasmas, I didn't want to go here. Plasmas are characterized in general by rather large separation of scales. So there is, for the systems we are looking at, is at least 6-8 orders of magnitude in scale separation between the system size and the smallest internal plasma scales. And the model that is kind of universally valid across all of those scales is a Vlasov-Maxwell or Boltzmann-Maxwell system. So there is a 6-dimensional PDE coupled to a full set of Maxwell's equations. And of course, this is impossible to solve over the whole range of scales. So there are a variety of approximations developed in plasma physics that target either a specific set of physics questions or a specific set of scales. And the approach that we're taking here is, in some sense, brute force. So we're taking these equations and trying to solve it for as large a range of scales as possible. We're using two set of models. So one is the fully kinetic simulations, where all the plasma species, electrons and ions, are described using Vlasov or Boltzmann equation. And this can be thought of as the true microscopic model for the system. And then the second class of models are referred to as hybrid simulations. So they can be thought of as a mesoscopic model. Here, the heavier species, the ions, are still treated kinetically, but the lighter species, the electrons, are treated as a fluid. So that removes small spatial and fast temporal scales from the problem, and it can be an adequate approximation under some conditions. So regardless of the specific models, these are very large simulations. We are trying to push them as far as possible, and that's why we need a big machine like Blue Waters. We're using a particle and cell method. It's a Monte Carlo type technique, a particle mesh method, where the plasma is described by a collection of Lagrangian markers that sample a distribution function and are moved along the characteristics of this equation. The electromagnetic field lives on the grid, and there is an interpolation between the field and the particles to collect charges from the particle and to interpolate forces from the grid. So it's a well-known old technique. So let me talk a little bit about some of the specific problems that we considered in year one and some of the results that we have gotten. So there are three problems. For each of them, we had to do many simulations. But the first problem is the generation of intense current sheets at or above the proton scales. The second is turbulence in low beta plasma, and the third one is universality of turbulent decay. So current sheets are basically regions where the gradients of the magnetic field are large, and those are regions, those are preferred sites for the energy dissipation, the process that we're interested in. Evolution of current sheets is a kind of an interesting problem, an interesting example of cross-scale coupling. They are formed by the large-scale dynamics, but how they evolve in time likely depends on the microscopic physics. So if you want to do this problem accurately, you need to have a model that's capable of accurately describing both large scales and small scales, and that's what we're trying to do here. our goal for the particular set of simulations that I'm showing was twofold. First, it was to validate some particular technique for interpreting spacecraft data, because a spacecraft samples the medium on a one-dimensional trajectory, it doesn't have a global view, and they have to make certain approximation about what they're seeing in order to extract kind of more sophisticated quantities than just 1D sample. So we can check those assumptions in our simulation that obviously has the full 3D fields. And of course, the second motivation is to check whether we are capable of reproducing the experimentally observed properties of these intense current sheets. So this animation on the left shows the 5 sigma events in the simulation domain. Those are the current sheets. Those are regions of large gradients and the preferred sites for the energy dissipation. We worked with people doing observations, and we tried to be very careful on how we interpret these simulations. We took, a sample on a 1D trajectory looping through the domain, extracted the properties of these current sheets, and performed direct comparison with the observations. And so maybe the details are not so important here, but what is important is that we found a rather remarkable agreement in the statistics of those current sheets, actually much better than we hoped for. So that is a very encouraging result. Allows us to, for example, now take this simulation and go on and study the microscopic details of the microscopic physics with understanding that we're doing something that is very much realistic and relevant to the real solar wind. So the second class of problem concerns universality of some properties of decaying turbulence, and the kind of simple way of looking at it is this: that in collisionless plasmas there are several quadratic conserved quantities such as magnetic helicity and cross helicity. They're conserved in the limit of in the limit where dissipation is absent. When the dissipation is present, they're thought to have kind of rather weak decay rates, which are different for different quantities. And this disparity in the decay rates kind of imposes a special relaxation path onto the system. So the system decays towards special states that are characterized by approximate conservations of these quantities. So this has been studied quite a bit in fluid turbulence and in plasma too, but using very simple approximations which completely neglect the microscopic physics. We try to kind of repeat almost the same type of approach using kinetic codes, and to our surprise, we found that we can't. There is so an example is shown here. This is a kind of a phase space of the problem in terms of cross helicity and magnetic helicity normalized to the energy, and the notion that exists in MHD. In MHD is a magnetohydrodynamic approximation, the model that's valid at large scales, is that the only thing that you need to know to predict the evolution of the system is the initial value of these two parameters, and then it will decay along the particular path. What we are seeing is that in our kinetic simulations, the system maybe follows this path for a little bit, but then goes off to a completely different direction. And it was a little bit puzzling. We spent a lot of time kind of validating the simulations, checking for errors and such, but now we're reasonably confident that simulations are converged and everything is good. And what it's probably telling us is that it is what we cannot do in the kinetic simulation is that we cannot arbitrarily turn off dissipation. Dissipation is what it is. It's dictated by kinetic physics. And what this is telling us is that it's very hard to come up with a realistic system that is kind of dissipation-less enough for this to hold. So it's another interesting result. So this awaits further work, I would say. Okay, and the final set of problems concerns the physics of turbulence in low beta plasma. So specifically, we looked at some observations performed by MMS. MMS is the newest NASA mission to study magnetic reconnection in turbulence in the Earth's magnetosphere. And there was a paper recently published that presented results of observations of turbulence in the magnetosheath. This is this region between the bow shock and the magnetopause. So here, this yellow region where the plasma is shocked, so it's hot, and it's characterized by disparity in temperatures between ions and electrons. And what it does, this disparity kind of separates further the internal scales. You can separate ion and electron scales very well. And in the observations, you can see several transitions. So there is a transition in the property of the turbulence at around the proton scales, which is well known and expected. But then there is another transition somewhere later on to something else. And one way to see this transition is to look at the quantity called magnetic compressibility. This is kind of a fingerprint of the type of fluctuations. And here it is rising from some characteristic value to another characteristic value. So we did our simulations, and I should say that these observations were explained using a rather simple theory. So we did these simulations working with people who did the observations and the theory, and found nothing like they see. So the simulations do not reproduce neither the observations nor the simple theory. What is most surprising is that we did a variation on that theory using kind of a more accurate, supposedly, analysis, and also found that this more accurate analysis behaves like our simulations, but not the simple analysis. And so we're here at the point where I would say there's an interesting puzzle. Something interesting is going on. That the system is kind of a seemingly pathological situation where the very simple-minded analysis yields results that reproduce experimental observations, and the more sophisticated analysis does not. So usually that doesn't necessarily mean that there is an error. Usually that means that there is a certain interesting processes going on that push the system towards the state where these simplified assumptions are valid. All right, so this is where we are. This is summary. I'll let you read it. We've been on Blue Waters with this particular project for about 9 months. It's a really brand new project, so we have 1 paper under review, 3 more kind of in the works, and just started working on another one. That's the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you.